Welcome to Overeducated and Underemployed. I really appreciate you tuning in today. I'm Feddun. Make sure to check out my website at feddun.net to see everything I'm doing right now. That's Feddun.net, feddun.net. Today begins our three-part series on the topic of nostalgia. And we're going to be talking about the topic in three different mediums. We're going to be talking about nostalgia in music, nostalgia in movies and television, and then, of course, nostalgia in video games and retro gaming. When it comes to nostalgia in music, I think nostalgia, can be the opposite of depression. They say if you focus too much on the future, you're going to be anxious. And if you focus too much on the past, that you're going to be depressed. But I think if you focus on the past in a nostalgia kind of tint, it can change the dynamic of that. In the last 20 years or so, especially, there have been a lot of reunion tours, a lot of bands touring that don't even have all of the original members or don't even have the majority of the band being original members, but still touring under the banner of a certain band name. And then you've got bands with their full lineup doing revivals of old albums and recording some of their music and doing tours where they play entire albums at a time. Bands that broke up for decades doing one-off reunion weekend shows. And then, of course, you have bands that kind of stopped putting out new music at a certain point and were able to just capitalize on the hits they already had over the years. I'm sure I'm missing some things, but one thing that I've noticed is I've seen a lot of these bands do these reunion tours, and I've also noticed that a lot of people my generation kind of stopped listening to music, and of previous generations too. It's like you stop listening to music that's new after the age of 25. And I don't mean this for probably the general audience of this podcast, since a lot of people that listen to this are probably going to be music enthusiasts. But the average listener, life starts and music is not a big priority to them anymore. And they just hear what gets played for them in one way or another. They might occasionally get to go to a concert, but not like when they were in college, right? When we get to go to shows all the time and listen to music all day. And so I think part of it is just our lives become less conducive to finding new music. But I also think that there's something to just our personalities gelling at a certain point and us just being who we are. I think even with music enthusiasts, the stuff that we always gravitate back to is stuff we usually got into when we were younger. And I think that while we still get into new music on a regular basis, if we truly are music enthusiasts, it slows down. It definitely slows down. And part of that is just you have stuff that you like and you want to keep listening to. And so the amount of time that you have for new stuff gets smaller and smaller. And I think that's true for most people, but the amount of space they have for music is a lot smaller too. When you're not, some people are really into movies, some people are really into games, some people are really into none of those things. They're not really into digital media or anything like that. They prefer going out in nature, or maybe they've become artists and they make a lot of their own music. Or anyway, my point is that I think once we diverge into our own interests in our own lives, everybody gets into less and less new music. So the bands that we grew up listening to will always be something special to us and something that in turn is marketable to us. So this trend that we've seen, I think over the last 20 years, part of it is just until recently, these people weren't old, hadn't taken off. And sometimes it's they didn't pay their taxes. Sometimes they realize, I think this actually leads me to one reason I know that some bands have gotten back together is in the age of streaming, we have data on what people are listening to, even if it's stuff they bought or would have bought decades ago. And where someone might listen to the same 20 bands, but they've already bought their entire catalog. Sales weren't ever really indicative of what a live band might draw in a certain market. Whereas now, I think promoters, even the bands themselves, have a much better understanding of what songs, what bands people are returning back to in their middle of life, especially like the late 90s, early 2000s bands. And so that's part of why we're seeing this big revival. Another reason, though, I think it's just the people that loved a lot of music during the like time of CDs, which is a really like specific time in music history that I'll talk probably dedicate an entire episode to at one point. But once those kids, the people that grew up on CDs, the things that made it easy to listen to one song over and over. There was also just a phenomenon in the late 90s, early 2000s, mid 90s, even after Nirvana, where music became a cultural touchstone in a way that I don't think it had been in a couple of years at least, right? Like it had faded, I think, in the 80s to like more in the DJ scene where people would go out to clubs and listen to music, but they weren't necessarily buying it. And I think CDs, not only did people buy all of their back catalog again, but it made it easier to listen to the music that they were getting into, whether they were young or old, on the go and on demand. You could play the 5 songs you really liked from a band, but the band had no idea what those songs were. And you might get lucky and hear the songs. And I think eventually, in a similar way to like touring for a comedian, I think as a band tours, they figure out what songs people like and what they like live. But now they have the hard data to go off of. And yeah, I'm not saying that these revivals and reunions are like a new thing. Of course, they're not. They've been going on since music was the commodity. But I think it's, and this could just be because there are a lot of the bands that this could just be my perspective. This is pretty ahistorical, is the point that I'm making. It seems like there's been a big explosion of them in recent years. Of bands that like in some cases were one-hit wonders or gathered a cult following after they broke up. So I've seen a lot of these shows over the years. For instance, I've seen Zappa play Zappa, which is Dweezil Zappa playing the music of his dad, Frank, which I went through an interesting like dilemma about that because I'd also listened to an interview with Jacob Dylan around the time where he said he would never play his dad's music and he thought it was fucking weird and he didn't even like that people had asked him to. And on the other hand, Dweezil is one of the only people that can play Frank's music well. And not only that, Bob's music does not need to be carried on by his son. Like other people recorded and make some of his songs bigger hits than they ever were when he recorded them. So Bob Dylan doesn't need his son to go out and play his songs for the world to keep them alive. Whereas one could argue that Dweezil doing that is part of what has kept Frank's music alive. And he was a big part of the documentary that came out a few years ago about Frank Zappa. I've also seen the Beach Boys with Brian Wilson. This was probably 10 years ago. And one thing that stood out to me about that show is while it had all the original members for the first time in a long time, they also had a lot of young musicians and singers backing them up. And so it sounded great, but it also, like, you could tell that it wasn't just the Beach Boys making the sounds coming from the stage. I do think that carries a lot more value than, because for one, it's being like directed by the band themselves. Even if they aren't doing all the parts, they're at least approving of them. Whereas like when I was a kid, there was like 2 versions of Rat touring. And they like had a legal battle, and one was Rat featuring Stephen Pearcy, and one was just Rat, but it didn't have the lead singer. And it was just absurd to me because they were both essentially cover bands at that point. And it just made me realize from a really young age that these things are all about marketing. One of my favorite bands in the last 20, 30 years, the Flaming Lips, did a tour celebrating Yoshimi Battles the Pink Robots. I guess it's started with a 20th anniversary tour of it, and it's just continued until a certain point. And they did a tour where they played that entire album, and then they also played like a set afterward of I hesitate to call them hits, but the songs you want to hear if you're a Flaming Lips fan. And the Flaming Lips have always had like a really strong community and a really positive message, and their shows are like an experience, not just a concert. And I've seen them a few times over the years, never like in the 90s, but certainly in the early and mid 2000s. Some at Bonnaroo in 2007, and that was pretty insane. And then I did see the Yoshimi tour, and it was fantastic. They still sounded great. They played all the songs that you wanted to hear, and I think they knew that because of streaming. They knew what songs other than Yoshimi that everyone wanted to hear because they just played the top songs with streaming numbers on all the platforms, and it seemed to go over really well. It was a one-hit wonder type band called the Marvelous Three that I was really into as a kid. They were one of the first bands that I recognized had a really strong community following them, and that's, I think, what drew me to them. Partially because like my friends were becoming part of that community already, and so I just kind of got into it. But like anytime you see somebody going ape shit for something, it obviously makes you stop and be like, what is so exciting about that? Why are they so excited about it? And I think that's what led to my fandom with the Drive-By Truckers, which will be a recurring theme that comes up throughout this podcast. But that band has like just a really strong community, and it's something that I think a lot of other people envy in the music world, and even like it can be a model. And they're not even the first to do it, but they're the first to do it. They were one of the first bands to ever have a website, thanks to Jen Bryant. And so they created a lot of community. And I think, and I am going to talk about, they also did a show where they've never not been a band since this album came out, but they also did a tour where they played the Southern Rock Opera, their album in 2001, in its entirety with other songs from their catalog. Instead of doing like a separate set, they sprinkled them in where they thought they fit. And I thought that was brilliant too. It was like two different approaches. The Flaming Lips doing the album straight through and then the separate set. And then the Truckers did the Southern Rock Opera in its entirety, but then adding songs throughout instead of doing like a second set of different songs, even though they probably added enough songs to come close to doing a second set at least. And I think the reason I bring this up is like there's a big difference between nostalgia when it's still good and nostalgia when it either sucked in the first place or just doesn't hold up anymore. Like maybe it was great then, but it doesn't hold up now, and you don't get the same kind of feeling. Whereas some music, and this is like the sign of great art, and we'll talk about this in other mediums, but even if your perspective about it changes, like with the Truckers, there's songs like Zip City or Women Without Whiskey that obviously as you grow up, your perspective might change, but that's why they also included songs Primer Coat, because it's the sequel to Zip City in the sense that it's the same guy and he's just an adult now and like a 17-year-old asshole teenager. And I know I'm rambling here, but the point that I'm making is that great art grows with you. And I'll talk about this in all three of the nostalgia episodes where you have a totally different perspective from the music or the film or the game or whatever it is didn't change, but you did. And you see something completely different. And that can happen with people too. And we'll talk about that at some point. But, and even with the Flaming Lips, like songs like the Yeah Yeah song, which may have, like to me in college was mostly just like a fun pop song about being powerful. And now like I realize like how political it really is. I think it's really interesting to like just look at the two different approaches to that same concept of, okay, we're a band that never stopped touring and we're going to play an entire album from 20 plus years ago and see what happens. And I think both shows were phenomenal. They had really great visuals. The Flaming Lips are famous for their light shows and everything like that. And they also just kind of, in some ways, were stripped down. The show I saw, the drummer was really close to the front of the stage, and I was able to really watch him. And I think that's pretty common, but they didn't have a ton of people in costumes, and they didn't obviously do the UFO or anything like that, but it was just different, but than previous shows, but it allowed the band, because they stood on their own, to really shine. And the Truckers, I feel like they, in a lot of ways, just keep getting better and better. The Drive-By Truckers, they've had a lot of lineup changes over the years, but they've got the longest lineup right now that they've ever had. And musically, I think it's the best, hands down. You know, a lot of people, Jason Isbell is a great songwriter. A lot of people think that was like, even Patterson at one point was quoted in the documentary about them as calling it the dream team. And in a lot of ways it was, but they all had to move on from that. It's amazing they all survived it, and they've all gotten better beyond their time together, and they're friends now, and they've even performed together again. But their music, the Drive-By Truckers' music, as you age, it ages with you. Same with the Flaming Lips. And I would even argue same with the Beach Boys. Some of these one-hit wonder bands, maybe not. But the Marvelous Three, it was so the Marvelous Three, I think, is an interesting case study in this topic, because their music held up, their songs held up, but they were still like pop songs about a lot of angsty things. And not to say that's bad, and in some cases, like, it helped me return to some of those feelings, and not in a negative way. I think just being a little more sensitive and things like that in the moment even, but it didn't feel like the same thing where the music grew with me. It felt like it helped me reconnect with my younger self. And I think that is like that is what nostalgia at its core really usually is, right? Like, you're trying to reconnect with your younger self, and a lot of people do psychedelic drugs for the same reason. And we'll have episodes about how those are being used therapeutically. But I think the thing that is really striking to me about a band like the Marvelous Three is, like, their music held up, their live show held up, their songs were still fun to sing along to. There was still that community element, like, in a lot of ways. Like, I saw people I hadn't seen in 20 years because the community around that band was so strong. Even Butch, and it was super, like, close to the fans. He, like, back then, he would hang out before and after shows. Like, I was a kid, he got me into shows. Like, I remember there's a show in Chattanooga, he pretended to be my uncle just so I would get in. He was like, "Don't make me regret this," and leaned in real close and said that to me. But and 3 random people I'd met on the internet picked me up and drove me there. We were all safe, like, they weren't sketchy. It was like, it was all fine. Like, I had friends that had met them or whatever, but, and it sounds crazy now, but it was like year 1999 or 2000. But that community really still, you still felt it. Like, everybody was older and had lives, but when a band creates an event like that, and the Marvelous Three only did it in a couple of cities, so, like, you had to go to Chicago or Atlanta, or I think one other one, maybe New York or something like that last year. But if you didn't go to those cities, like, you didn't go. So it really created a sense of community, whereas, like, every Drive-By Trucker show, I think, has a sense of community, and in the sense that people know each other just from other shows. And the Flaming Lips shows, I think, have a sense of community just because they're all there to just express love and excitement. And even so, it's like an imagined community is, I believe, Althusser coined the term. Like, with a sports team or something, only, like, you love their music. And that's, to me, like, loving a sports team is arbitrary. Loving music is, like, pretty meaningful. So I think, like, the point that I'm making was, like, these reunion shows were more than just about the music, right? They were more about the community, revisiting the art in a way that helped you continue to grow. At least for me, like, your perspective on some of these songs and bands might change in some cases, and that'll help you understand, like, how you're different. And then sometimes it's like those bands remind you of things that you really need to be reminded of. And I think when you look at these 3 bands, and a lot of people might not even know who all 3 of these bands that I'm talking about are, but if you look at the Flaming Lips, the Marvelous Three, and the Drive-By Truckers, you all took a different approach to this. Butch Walker from the Marvelous Three went on to become a record producer, had a solo career. solo tours, occasionally played Marvelous 3 songs, and occasionally even did reunions on stage for a couple of songs, but they hadn't done like a real reunion like this in almost 20 years, or maybe exactly 20 years, since they played at the Olympic Centennial Park, and it was like right before 9/11, if I'm not mistaken. I feel like I don't know. My memory is a little fuzzy there, but I feel like it was like in late August of 2001. And yeah, like people that had met 20 years ago, 25 years ago, hadn't seen each other in 20 or 25 years, saw each other again. Drive-By Truckers shows always have this sense of community, but these Southern rock opera shows also got us to really, they've got over 200 songs. Even like people that have seen them a lot may have heard most of the Southern rock opera live at one point, but hearing that, all of it, or even a significant portion of it altogether, did not happen. And they don't play with a set list. So even seeing them play the same show multiple nights was a new experience, because they, like, I had never in over 100 shows seen them play the same show more than once. And then I saw this tour 4 times. Seeing them play the same show 4 times was a new experience for me, if that makes sense. Same with the Flaming Lips. Like, I've never seen all of the songs off of Yoshimi and seeing them in an order, and that was really special. And then the Marvelous 3, they didn't play like a particular album. In fact, they pretty much didn't play anything off of their first album. They played one song off of it from Math and Other Problems called Appetite. And I'd really like to hear more of that album, because honestly, listening to those 3 albums, they had 3 albums and then they put out a 4th when they did the reunion called 4. But listening to those 3 albums, I think their first one like holds up the best. They're all still good, but I've really felt like their first one held up the best over time. So I'd really, if they do these reunions again, I'd like to see them do more of these songs. So I think like the big core about these is like, you have to have some kind of a, just because you heard a fucking song on the radio doesn't mean you want to go see the band 20 years later. But I do think if you have like personal connections and community associated with this music, or it's really good fucking art that you can, your perspective about it has changed over the years and it's grown with you, or if it just helps you, remind you of like part of yourself that you might have forgotten. I think these reunion tours are actually, when the product is good, when the music is good, when the band is still pretty much the full band. I understand, like, people, one of the bands I worked with when I was younger, Social Burn, they did some reunion shows, and then this was like 10 years ago, maybe more. And the drummer couldn't do it for whatever reason. And so they had a manager, that their manager, Terry Clark, is a great drummer, maybe a better drummer. And he stepped in and played those shows, and like, nobody cared. Like, it wasn't, but it didn't feel like a cover band. It felt like, like at the most they just had a different drummer. I think when you see, from I went and saw Chicago, and he's a horn player, and they had like most of the original horn section, so that was cool for him. But he said otherwise it was basically a cover band. Like, and I don't understand. Like, it's literally just at that point like, they got the rights to call themselves a certain band name, and that's weird to me. And when I saw the Beach Boys, like, felt like that was like the line, right? The line between cover band and reunion was when I saw the Beach Boys with Brian Wilson, because I really felt like the Beach Boys with Brian Wilson, it was what they wanted. It sounded like the fucking Beach Boys. It's what the Beach Boys wanted. They were all there. They all approved of how it all went. But you could also tell that a lot of the parts were being played and sung by younger people that could handle them. And they were doing what they could. And it was fine. It wasn't amazing. I felt lucky to get to see that at my age, but it wasn't. And that's why I think sometimes these bands wait too long. The Violent Femmes are doing a reunion tour right now where they're playing, I think, their entire debut album. And I'll probably do a short review of that show. They're coming to my city and I'll do a review of it. I'm going. I'm not, and full disclosure, I'm not like a person that ever really got into the Violent Femmes, and I'm a little bit apprehensive about this because they're playing with an orchestra, but it's all the original members as far as I know, so we'll see. But I also, like, that's a band that like got a cult following, like after they had one hit, and then got a cult following over the years. And that band's 40 years old. Like, their first album came out in 83, and I saw, like I said, I saw the Beach Boys 10 years ago, at least, probably more like 12. And So that would have made them like over 50 years into their career. So like maybe it was just too late. I'm sure I'll have more to say about this in future episodes. Thanks again for tuning in to Overeducated and Underemployed. I'm Feddun. Check out my website, feddun.net. Feel free to donate if you want to support the pod. And stay tuned for the next episode on nostalgia in movies and television. And remember, if you want me to answer a question on the podcast, go ahead and send it over to feddunxr@gmail.com. That's FEDDUNXR@gmail.com.